Morning. Can you hear me okay? Good morning everyone, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this event that we've organised. This is in collaboration between the Norton Owners Club and Elk Promotions, run by everyone knows Julie, of course. Julie. My name is Paul Smith. I'm the Vice Chairman of the Norton Owners Club, and I guess in discussion with Julie, this was our idea. Over the years, I've heard Mike Jackson speak several times, and I've always been impressed with his memoirs, the things his career, the things he's done, and his wit. And I always feel there's never enough time. So I thought, why not give the guy, a proper chunk of time to talk about what he's done in his life. Today is in two parts. We're starting now, and then we'll finish about 12. We'll have an hour's break. And I hope that the first part will prompt some ideas in your head, and you'll come back and join us again at 1 o'clock and ask Mike some questions. You may have noticed several cameras around the room. We've got our cameraman here, Mike, and this is all going to be recorded. The intent is to load it all up on YouTube, so that not just us in the room can enjoy this, but anyone in the world can look at it on YouTube and get the benefit. That's it from me, really. I'm sure many of you know Brian Crichton. We're very pleased to have him with us this morning. He's our compere for the day. I'll hand over to Brian now. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, Paul. And welcome, everybody, ladies and gentlemen. Nice to have a lady here amongst the audience. So, on behalf of Julie Diplock, show organiser, Elk Promotions, and the Norton Club, welcome to this speech talk by Mike Jackson. Hasn't the club done a wonderful job to get all these banners up? And the bikes are fantastic, aren't they? We've got Mark Wyman's 1970 S Commando and Anthony Curzon's Ranger. So thank you, Anthony. And it's great to see so many VIPs in the crowd. We've got Nick Jeffrey. Now Nick's read more books on motorbikes than anybody on the planet. Dennis Frost, Velocette leading light, and 30 years Concord judge at the Stafford Show. So Alan Cathcart, well, Alan has become a legend. He's ridden more race bikes than anybody on the planet. Peter Henshaw, written more than 50 books now, Peter?
Something like that.
Yeah. How many is it? It's 80, is it? 80 books, isn't that amazing? And Anthony Curzon, who knows more about the big twins from the Norton AMC era than anybody on the planet. So, but our star guest is Mike Jackson. Now Mike, in just over a year's time, he'll celebrate 60 years in the industry. Now that's an amazing innings, 60 years. And in just over a year's time, it'll be 70 years since he first started competition riding. Now, Mike, those 25 years with Norton, he started with 69, joining Norton Villiers. It was 25 years with Norton companies. And he started with Norton in an amazingly exciting era. The motorbike scene was bursting, like Technicolor. Films with new big bikes coming on the scene, racers wearing coloured leathers, the Americans coming over to race. It was such an exciting period. So much was happening. Some of it good, some of it brilliant, some of it not so good from the British industry point of view. We're going to ask Mike how he got involved with Norton, who interviewed him, how he got started, and what happened after that. So, ladies and gentlemen, I ask you for a warm round of applause for our star speaker, Mike Jackson.
Hello. Well, after an intro like that and with 4 VIPs, I think you've got the wrong bloke up here. We ought to have. Anyway, that's can you hear me? Well,
yeah, we can.
I'm sticking this in the right place.
Can everybody hear him? Can you all hear Mike?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Well, I got involved with 2 wheels at about 9 or 10 years old with a Triumph bicycle that my father bought from Curry's, which coincided with my brother starting trials on a bantam through the RAC-ACU club. We were in Southampton, very big motorcycle club in Southampton, 450 members at peak, and they had an RAC-ACU scheme, and it was run by some trials riders. My brother started trials riding, and you know you always look up to your elder brothers, don't you? He was 5 years older than me. I started going to trials, started reading the Blue and Green, and became hooked on motorcycles. And of course I loved Triumph because I had a Triumph bicycle. I pretended I was a Triumph Works rider. And at that time, both my brother and I wrote off to the motorcycle factories annually for a pamphlet. They weren't called catalogues or brochures in those days. Got pamphlet, mister. And some manufacturers responded, even Vincent responded, but Triumph never did, but Norton did. And the Norton brochure at that time, we're talking, I think, about 1949, 1950, their catchphrase in the first pamphlet I got from Norton was, "We won the first TT, the last TT, and 26 in between." And that, I thought that was something. A year later, I sent off again, and the figure had gone up from 26 to 28. And I think they repeated it the third year. So my allegiance moved from Triumph to Norton as a result of that. I then became 16 eventually, as we all do, and started on trials, not on a Norton or a Triumph, but on a Norton. I very rapidly wore that out, and so we had to buy a second-hand Commando. This is a real Commando, because James were the first people to use the Commando, and the Commando was a very important bike in the trials world, because people would get off their 500 four-stroke onto a Commando, and for the first time in their lives would start winning an award. It was designed by Bill Lomas, and it gripped and it handled, and the forks were damped, and I bought one, a second-hand one, and it was quite good. And by the time we got to the following spring, the Southampton Club were having their annual scramble, so I thought, well, why don't I put a spring frame on it and enter the scramble. A chap called Lynn Harfield of LCH fame put a spring frame on it, but except the Commando wasn't ready for the meeting, so I borrowed my brother's 500 Triumph, which he was then riding, with trials tyres, and rode that in my first scramble and won 7 and 6. I thought, well, scrambles are more fun than trials. So when the Commando was finished the following week with a spring frame, I began a season of scrambles. During this, of course, that was my trials bike. And my bro, who sort of controlled me a little bit, said, well, you're not going to be able to ride that spring frame bike in trials, are you? We'd better get you a second-hand trials bike for next year. So we bought a second-hand 500T, 105 pounds. Luckily, it had been owned and ridden by a poser who'd never ridden it in trials. God knows how he got one, because in those days you couldn't buy a trials bike, but that you produced your license to the dealer. But this chap, who was well known in Southampton as a poser, had this 500T, so I snapped it up in quite good condition for 105 quid. I think I'd get my money back if I put it in the market at Bonhams today. So there we were. I was riding this Wheezy 197 Commando with a spring frame in scrambles, not doing very well, not winning any prize money. And we came to the annual Winchester Scramble, a local derby, just about 12 miles from where we lived, and it broke down. It went fut. And my bro, again thinking, said, well, we better go home and get the 500T, and you can ride that in the last race, which is the non-winners. They pay down to 4th place, and it's 4 quid for first. How about that? So he dashed home in our A40 pickup and brought my 500T back. We took the silencer off, strapped on the number plates, and I went out in this non-winners race and finished second on a rigid Everybody else was on plunger gold stars or mattresses with McCandless spring frames. So I finished that first scramble season on a bit of a high. I won £3 for the second place in the non-winners, and then went into trials that season, that winter, of 55 on the 500T, and I was getting a little bit big-headed because it was so quick and so wonderful between sections. And I remember in a Bridport trial, there were all my chums on 197s going up a tarmac road towards some hilly sections, and they were blocking the road. So I thought, I'll go on the grass verge and go by them and do a wheelie when I come off the grass verge onto the tarmac. And I didn't realize there was a drainage ditch halfway along. And I went into, best thing ever happened to me, I went into the drainage ditch and broke my collarbone, and that brought me down to earth a bit. And that was my first experience after the scramble on a Norton, breaking my collarbone on a Norton in a trial. Finished that season on the James Commando and then onto a Barnet and so on and so forth. Eventually ended up on a Greaves, but that's a story for another day. So that's how I came to love and like Norton in a nutshell, in a very confused nutshell.
Right, thank you for that introduction, Mike, on getting involved with Norton.
Is that it? Can I go home now?
Yeah, we'll send a check. Now, Mike, in 1969, you were working for AJS, and who approached you to join Norton?
Well, I've been 5 years, 5.5 very happy years at Greaves, and I saw an advertisement in MCN for a sales manager AJS. That was in about November or December, 68 or 69. And so I sent off for it and went and had an interview with Peter Inchley, the road racer and tuner. And as I say, that was in November or December. And never heard anything more January, February, March. But in April, there was, and I was still with Greaves, in April, there was a show at Brighton. We'd lost Earl's Court, hadn't we, by then? And the motorcycle shows tended to be in Blackpool or Olympia and Brighton. And the Brighton Club, rather go ahead, they had a scramble on the Sunday. It was a 3-day show, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. They had a scramble on the Saturday, and I managed to get time off to ride in the scramble to get up to park the Greaves stand, go up on the downs and ride in the scramble, provided I was back by 4 or 5 o'clock, which I was. Well, at 5 o'clock on that Saturday afternoon, historically in April, suddenly a tall chap moseyed over from the Norton stand. Norton had just announced the Roadster, the fastback being their first ever model, not awfully popular, not as popular as it should have been because of the unique styling, but the Roadster came out of Brighton and it was a sensation. Anyway, a chap moseyed over from the Norton stand and said, "Oh, you Mike Jackson, yeah." He said, "You've got the job at AJS, can you start next week?" So I thought, well, no, I can't, but I will let you know. So I wanted to give my notice to Greaves, and I was not going to give my notice on the stand during a show. And I thought we'll wait till the dust settles, and I'll go up there very quickly and see my boss, Preston Cobb, the wonderful man in the wheelchair, and give my notice officially, and then start at AJS. Unfortunately, he took ill for a week, so I couldn't go and see him for a week. Well, it wasn't a sort of matter you could discuss with Bert Greaves. He wasn't that sort of a bloke. Anyway, eventually gave my notice formally to Greaves and joined AJS at Truxton, selling the new Stormer. The Stormer was, there isn't a picture of it here, unfortunately, but it was a little bit too late to make a real impact, but it was a brilliant bike, designed, of course, by Bob Trigg of Commando Frame, and the frame duplicated that of the Commando with a strong beam under the tank, 2 thin down tubes, and a revamped Star Maker motor. The Star Maker motor, which was originally, you remember, announced with a big, do you remember it had 2 carburetors? It was announced in about 60, when was it?
I think it was the mid-60s.
Yes.
The year.
I remember going to the Earl's Court show onto the Villiers stand and asking the chap with a straight face, got 2 carburetors, is one for a Saturday scramble and the other for a Sunday. And it went over his head, but it didn't fulfill its expectations until Peter Inchley came along, and he slotted one into a bull taco frame and came third in a TT, did he not, at 90 miles an hour. He sorted out the Star Maker. He needed a new head and barrel to do it, and that became the basis of the AGS Stormer Scrambler, which was on the market from about 68 onwards, sold as AJS, part of the new Norton Villiers company. And I ended up there in May 1969 as a European sales manager, from Greaves Rep 1 week to which was makes you wonder about Norton Villiers, what they were doing, but there we are. And I was working for Peter Inchley, and we had a warehouse of unsold Stormers, so that was my first task. I was sharing an office with Bob Manns. The new Norton company had just moved to Andover, London overspill. The hardware was all made at Wolverhampton in the old Villiers works, and came down overnight in a series of lorries and built into motorbikes at Andover, tested at Thruxton, and then put in a packing case and sent off to an unwary a customer somewhere around the world. So, but I was strictly on AGS, which were also made in Wolverhampton but assembled at Andover. And by the time I arrived, they weren't selling very well. Greaves was still market leader, harried by CZ and Mako and Java and CZ. There was a lot of opposition, but there we are. I spent 9 months or so purely on AJS at Andover, sharing an office with Bob Manns, which was very fulfilling.
Within just over a year after you joined Villiers, you found yourself in America, promoting Villiers and Norton as becoming key man for Norton in the States.
Yes.
How did that come about, Mike?
Well, Dennis Paul, who was running the show, was very keen that we imported our own bikes in as many markets as possible, so that we took the profit as importer in France, Italy, America, Canada, Australia, rather than an independent importer who then sold to dealers. So we were the importer in a number of markets, and we then sold to dealers. It helped, there wasn't a lot of profit in making the Commando, but that was a key factor. Now in America, that market had been controlled, British and Italian bikes, for years by the famous Berliner company in New Jersey, back east. And they had Ducati, Guzzi, Metzeler, Norton, Matchless, and so on. They were the people. And they imported Nortons over many years for every single state. Well, my boss, Dennis Paul, was a good negotiator and managed to tickle 7 states away from them by arrangement on the West Coast. But one of the states was Alaska and one was Hawaii, so there wasn't a lot of business there. But we did have 5 crucial states where we set up as in rivalship, if you like, to Berliner. And there were various agreements that we would both sell at the same price, and we wouldn't poach each other's dealers and so on. And our 5 states encompass California, Oregon, Nevada, and Washington. So they were, California being the biggest market, biggest state in USA. So that was quite handy. And Dennis bought a Dodge van. He hired Maxie Maxted, the old Smith Speedo rep, who was then working and living in America, and he hired Brian Slark as our service manager, pinched him from Triumph BSA, and we had a 9-man firm in an old second-hand tin warehouse in Long Beach, and that was Norton Villiers Corporation. Sounded very grand, but it was a galvanized iron warehouse. We have a photograph of it later. 9 people. Our greatest rivals, of course, were BSA Triumph up in the Hollywood, up at Duarte. They had 150 people. That gives you an idea of the scale, how small Norton were and how large were BSA Triumph. And they too, like us, had rivals with Ducati and Guzzi, the 750 Honda 4, the Kawasaki 3, what was it called, the H1, the Suzuki Kettle, and the Yamaha XS 650, and the Benelli Tsunami, Tornado. So this was the creation, this was the start of the superbike market, and there were 7 or 8 choices between 650 and 750cc, and the Commando was hanging in there. And my job title was general manager, effectively sales manager, with this 8 or 9 man team. And again, we had a warehouse full of Commandos to flog, but would you believe, our 5 states equaled the same number. We were selling as many as Berliner with their 43 states. They had 43 states and we had 7, and our sales equaled them, because obviously Norton was in our heart. In the case of the Berliners, they were spread quite wide with a number of brands. And we got on pretty well with Berliners. We had taken over their 7-state network, and once they got used to us, they were fine. You know, we spoke a different language. You know, hey, you Limeys, you got a funny accent. You know, but it worked. It worked.
Mike, your accent must have gone down really well in the States.
Oh, I'm from Hampshire. Yes, a British accent does. The Americans seem to like that, and we never had any. We never had any communication problems, really. Even though, you know, on a motor car, a boot is a trunk and a hood is a bonnet, and we are divided by a common language.
We are, yeah. Now, Mike, promoting Norton, especially the Commando, how did the Americans view Norton? What did they think of this British mark?
Norton had not been that large in America. I don't think Berliner had held it back, but they were also doing Ducati and Benelli. And the main British motorcycle for years in America, of course, was the Triumph Twin, seconded by the BSA Twins. And Norton's, you know, Atlases and Rangers and so on, had done okay from 500cc to 600, 650, up to 750 Mercuries and Atlases and so on. But the Commando was something new, and they, like a lot of people in England, didn't really understand the isolastic at first. So we had to sort of educate our customers and our dealers that this was a compromised motorbike. Yes, a compromised design, but the isolastic did isolate the vibration to all, once you got to 2,400 RPM, it virtually eliminated vibration. And every single advert we ran, famously on the inside front cover with a girl, that had a little side panel explaining about the isolastic. So our Norton market in America switched from feather-bedded frames to isolastic frames gradually and quite successfully. Of course, Norton had won Daytona 30 years previously on the sand at Daytona with camshafts, and America, being the land of the free, then banned camshafts, you know, as you'd expect. So Norton had got out of racing in America for a long, long time until we at Norton Villiers Corporation Long Beach decided to help Jody Nicholas and Harold Allison race a commando-engined flat tracker at Ascot Park. And Jody Nicholas was a worked Suzuki rider. He was just back from Vietnam. He was a jet pilot and a concert violinist as well, a wonderful bloke, kind of more intelligent than the average racer. And he started racing this private Norton flat tracker at Ascot, but without our support, money and parts, and began winning. And so that was a new element for Norton, and that helped. Sales in those days on flat tracks did help sales in the market. Sorry, wins at the flat track did help sales, you know, a win on Friday. Ascot was always held at night. I think that was a daytime photograph we posed, but the track was an adobe clay track, and there's moisture that comes out of the air in smoggy LA, and the surface of the adobe track at Ascot changed from the daytime to the nighttime. Norton's never won a race in the daytime at Ascot, but we could win at night because this engine gripped on the clay at night. Strange, and that helped Jody clean up. And he actually won the Ascot Championship 2 years running on a Norton. Our first main victory since we had won at Daytona 3 consecutive years, 30 years previously. So we were doing some of the right things. And of course we ran those wonderful advertisements in Cycle World. Dennis Paul had, on a marketing trip to America in '68, had reserved the inside front covers of the 2 biggest magazines in perpetuity, forever. And each ad cost us about the price of 3 commandos, can you believe? But we would get about 50,000, something like 50,000 inquiries for every time that inside front cover was opened and read by a consumer. It was very, very successful. When down the road, 73, 74, 75, and we still held on to those front cover positions. Honda and other companies wanted the inside front cover, and the publishers had to say, sorry, Norton have got it forever. And it also had the effect of people thinking we were a much bigger company than we actually were. It didn't say in that advert that we were only 9 people in a tin shed, but people reading that, you know, the Norton Girl ads, which were not crude, they were tasteful. People reading those advertisements thought we were the same size as BSA or Triumph and possibly some of the Japanese. You know, it was good strategy by Dennis Paul. He worked that out quite well. So, as I say, blowing our own trumpet, we were doing some of the right things, you know. Okay, the bikes leaked oil and they misfired and that, but we were selling them.
Well, the ads did look wonderful. They were wonderful period ads. So it's interesting to learn that they worked a treat, but not surprising. Now, let's look at our first slide. So, is that Jody Nicholas on the bike?
No, that's Jody worked for Joe Parkhurst, and on the day that we'd hired the photographer, he was on a project. So I think that's Frank Gillespie on a borrowed Norton, and we had to do it at daytime because we couldn't have got the whole thing in at night. A flash on the camera would not have captured the billboard. That was, I think, 30 30 feet by 12 feet or something, the ad, and they wanted 1,200 quid. We were negotiating with, the dirt season in America runs from April to October. It doesn't run in the, and we were talking with them in February and March, and they wanted 1,200 quid plus painting. Nobody had come along that year for their main billboard, and I managed to get it down, I think, to £800 and got it painted. So it was a bit of a bargain, but it made a huge hole in our local advertising budget. But the bit of luck we had that nobody came forward the following year, and we couldn't afford to go on the following year, so they left it up. We got 1 year free. So, some you win some, you lose some. But it's and the expression, it came about. I claimed some participation, but also Brian Slark. Hands up, who's heard of Brian Slark in the? Oh yeah. He's Mr. Norton, a Norton guru, ex-AMC, pinched by Bud Eakins to go and work in America. A good, if you cut his arm off, it would say Norton, you know, where the bone and flesh was exposed. Slarky's a good guy. And he was working on a customer Norton, or a road test Norton, out in the warehouse one day, and he kept coming into the office. He said, "What a talk about, these bikes are so talky." And over our cup of cocoa that morning, we said, why don't we plug this in our local advertising? So we hammered out this expression, a lot of talk about Norton, and it seems to have stuck. You know, it says it all. Yeah. Could I just do another bit of research, which affects our session too? How many people have seen the film On Any Sunday? Oh, well, a lot of good enthusiasts here. 10 out of 10. 10 out of 10. Sorry, I digress.
Carry on.
But anyway, that worked for us. It was the only place in America we could afford to advertise, but it was our local track. And Ascot Park it was the equivalent in the flat track world to Brands Hatch here in the road racing world. You know, it was a great hive. To win at Ascot was difficult and very helpful.
Well, a lot of talk about Norton, that's a great line. So, and it sticks in the memory. I remember those ads, buying those magazines in the early 70s, and seeing the Norton ads, and the glamour of the Norton Commando.
Yes,
it just sticks with you.
Interrupting me, this never appeared on the Norton Girl ads, and so we did this in spite of Dennis Paul, but he nodded, when we finally told him about it, he nodded his approval. I've got an amusing thing. Ascot, the number 2 man at Ascot was Don Basile of Mexican, like many good blokes in Los Angeles. He'd come from Mexico. And when he was trying to flog us this ad, he said, "Hey, you know, you ought to take this space. We get aficionados here." Now, I was expecting a Mexican to say aficionado, but he'd been in Los Angeles so long, he said, "You know, we get a lot of aficionados here." I never remember that, but anyway, he finally talked us into it at a reduced price, so there we are.
Now, on the interweb, there's a site that lists the most famous motorcyclists in the world. Guy Martin's up there on the list. Does anyone here know who is number 1 on the list? Who, sorry?
Valentino Rossi?
No. Steve McQueen, you got it. Steve McQueen. And Mike tried to sign Steve McQueen for Norton. Tell us about that, please, Mike.
Oh, yes. On Any Sunday was previewed to the industry at Paramount Studios in February '72. They had about 130 hours of film, and we were having a 20-minute preview, and all the industry, which apart from Harley-Davidson and Bultaco in San Fran, every manufacturer was based in Los Angeles, so they were obviously going to get. And the idea of inviting the dealers to the preview is that the film was going to be marketed through the dealer networks, not advertised in local rags and that, but it was a motorcycle documentary. The producer-director, Bruce Brown, had made the definitive surfer film for that called Endless Summer. So he knew a little bit about filmmaking, and he'd become friendly with McQueen, and McQueen was putting money into On Any Sunday, and of course also featured. Now, to those of you, to the many people in the room who have watched it, you may recall or may not recall that they never mention a make of motorcycle once in the film. Funny, but 90 minutes of film, there they are, the Harleys on the track, the Husqvarnas on the off-road and so on, with Mert Law riding a Greaves, but you will not hear Bruce Brown does the voiceover. He never mentions a name of the motorcycle. That's interesting. Anyway, we were invited to Paramount Studios. I got about a fortnight's notice. Well, Dennis Paul's secretary was a bit of a dragon. I hope her auntie isn't here in the audience. And she was, amongst other things, she was a film buff. So I used to send a daily telex back to London, and showing off a bit, I said, oh, don't contact me next Tuesday. I'm going to Paramount Studios, you know, as one does, to see a film being hosted by Steve McQueen and Joe Parker. So I thought, well, that'll impress our dragon back in London. Well, she told her boss about it, and he rang up immediately and said, meet Steve McQueen and see if he'll do our dealer poster next year. In those days, we did one poster a year for the Commando. So that was my mission. Anyway, a week's time, I went up to Paramount Studios, and impressive, because they're huge areas. And there were lots of young, excited girls at the gate, so I knew Steve McQueen had arrived. And it was quite a bit bizarre. You go in, and there's a main avenue, and on either side of this avenue, it's about 50, 100 yards wide, are these building facades from previous films. There are bank buildings and institutional buildings and cowboy village buildings and so on. And the do is in the VP, the Vice President's suite, down at the far end, floodlit. And so I thought, well, that's where I've got to go. And I went down there. I thought, well, it'll be a doddle getting hold of Steve McQueen. But the other 150 people there also wanted to speak to Steve McQueen. And there was a cocktail party going on before the running of the film. And I was getting into a bit of a panic because you could not get near Steve McQueen. So how was I going to carry out my mission? Anyway, I said to Joe Parkhurst, who was the publisher of Cycle World and the co-host, I'm an old friend of Eric Cheney's, and Steve McQueen always used Cheney frames on his motocrosses. Could you whisper in his ear that a chum of Eric Cheney's is here? So he did that to Steve McQueen, and Steve McQueen shooed all the rubberneckers out of the way, and I got my 5 minutes with him and explained that we'd like him on the poster. And he said, well, I sold my body to some bandits. They market my neck for medallions and my arms for wristwatches and gloves, my legs for shoes and jeans and so on. Pardon the expression, they even used my pecker if I left them, you know. I mean, he was very practical, but he said, I'll ring you back tomorrow as to how much it'll cost, but it'll be a lot of money. And good as gold, he rang back the next morning. It would have put something like $20 on the price of the Norton in America. It was so much money, not his fault. So we failed on that. And he said something very interesting. He always bought his bikes. He never ever took a free bike so that he could do what he liked with it, say what he liked about it. But and when his estate was wound up, there were about 150 bikes, all of which he was a collector of bikes and rode current street bikes as well. We have about one photograph of him on a Norton, but the majority of his pictures, of course, he's either on Husqvarna off-road or on Triumph on the street. But he did have a Commando, which he said he liked.
Right. Yes, you mentioned Eric Cheney. Steve McQueen apparently stayed at Eric's a few times while his frames were being built. And apparently it was freezing cold. And Steve said, "Look, Eric, I need a hot water bottle, but don't tell anybody."
Well, I'm blowed, yes. Funny thing about Eric Cheney, I used to run a upmarket concourse for the Louis Vuitton fashion people, and we had it at the Hurlingham Club in London. And we got Bud Ekins over one year as a judge. Now, Bud, too, is a great motorcycle personality and a collector of bikes. At one time, he owned 50 American brands of motorcycle. He was that keen on bikes. And they were going to put him up in the Dorchester here on Park Lane, Louis Vuitton, for 3 or 4 days. And he said, "No, I'm going to go and stay with Eric Cheney." And good old Bud, his chauffeur-driven car took him down to Eric Cheney's 3 nights running, rather than the Dorchester. So, but I don't know if he had a hot water bottle.
No. Well, Bud Ekins was Steve McQueen's hero. Everybody knows that. Let's look at our second slide. So, Mike, I don't know if anyone in the audience knows who that is. It looks almost like Rossi having up as a young.
No, it is
pre-war.
It has a nice link with Norton. It is Che Guevara, everybody's favourite terrorist. And at about the time, he was going around South America on a Norton, the Motorcycle Diaries of the book that resulted from that. And I don't know how many people in this room know that Norton forced him to become a terrorist. It was Norton's fault, which was quite an accusation, isn't it? You see, what happened, he and his chum, I think it was a doctor, they were on this Norton, or Nortons, riding around from Valparaiso to Nintendo, or whatever, from one country to the other, and it kept breaking down. Well, they would telegraph England for parts, and they took so long to arrive, they were out of the saddle for a long time. So eventually, he said, "Bugger this for a game of caramba," whatever they're saying. "Bugger this for a game of soldiers. I'm going to become a terrorist." So it was actually Norton's fault.
Brilliant. Would you put up the next slide, please, Terry? Now, you're in the States, Mike, trying to promote Commandos. Did you get to the flat tracks every week?
Yes, I went to Ascot every Friday night. From April to October. If I was in town, I went every night, every Friday night.
And at the weekend, you were riding in the desert, racing in the desert.
Yes, on Sunday, yeah.
Yeah. How did you fit it all in?
With a lot of excitement and a bit of panic.
Now, one of the off-road races you did was the Mint 400. Here's Mike doing the Mint in I'll put the year up, 72. Yeah.
Yes.
See my glasses.
The desert, the Mojave Desert, is inland, going east from the Pacific, and about 100 miles, 120 miles from Los Angeles, and it's at 3,000 feet, so there's a slight carburation adjustment. And that spreads through California right into Nevada, Area 51, and so on. So Slarky, Bud Ekins had got Slarky racing in the desert on a Triumph. And so Slarky, when I arrived in California in 1970, he was a retired desert racer, and he got me out we went and looked at a desert race, and I said I could do with some of that. And it was perfect for our AJ because we did offer a larger fuel tank and 1 or 2 other bits to convert our motocrosser into a desert racer. So I went desert racing from 70, 71 and 72. I did about 35, And to the credit of the AGS, I only had one DNF, and that was a puncher. The motor was unbreakable, unburstable. When you get a puncher, you can't really cope with that on 100 miles. But a great sport. Of all the motorcycling I've done, I think that being in a desert race, trying to catch a bloke about a quarter mile ahead and keep ahead of the bloke on your tail, that the thinking of the strategy and the sheer pleasure of that, especially in Cathedral Valley. Remember the cowboy films with those massive, we would have tracks in places like that, Jawbone and something Canyon, great areas. And although there's normally in a normal regular Sunday race, there's only about 1,000 people on the line. When you get to some of the bigger races, there are 1,500 people on the start line is over a mile long, dead engine. And there's a bonfire of, don't tell the environmentalists, there's a bonfire of tyres about 4 miles on the horizon called the bomb. And that creates a lot of black or white smoke. And so this mile-long line of riders, dead engine start, once you start, you look through the dust and aim for the bomb. The fact that a yank on an out-of-control Triumph may come across your bows at 30 degrees is just par for the course. You may also hit a cactus while you're aiming for the bomb, so it is quite exciting. When you get to the bomb, the course is actually marked. It's usually 20, 30 feet wide with ribbon on trees and markings when you cross a ravine or in a sand wash or whatever. So it's actually quite scientific. And they have hare and hounds and hare scrambles. A hare scramble is 2 laps of the same 50-mile course, and you fill up with fuel after the first 50 miles. And a hare scramble is 1 lap of a 50-mile course, fill up with fuel, and then a lap of a different course. And they both, and then they have Grand Prix. In the West Coast, a Grand Prix is a desert race in a ghost town, either Hope Town, the Bob Hope Ranch in Fernando Valley, or going back to on any Sunday, Elsinore. Remember there's about 6 or 7 minute clip of the film where Steve McQueen finishes 10th. Elsinore was an old abandoned spa town between San Diego and Long Beach, and ideal for a desert race. And I rode 3 of those, and that's 1,000 riders starting in packs of 10 at 10-second intervals. And the Americans don't do metric, of course, but there we are. And that takes place on part tarmac, part dirt, in the city of Elsinore. And there are I rode in other desert races, including Hope Town, but they call them Grand Prix. Nothing to do with European Grand Prix. Complicated, isn't it?
It is, yeah. Well, in 1972, in the mid-200, Mike and his co-rider, that 400-mile race, led the 250 class to lap 6, but a wire on the magneto melted. But that's a remarkable achievement.
Yeah, and then something melted, and we packed up. Incidentally, Norton had the evolution of bikes in the American desert. Quite interesting. First after the war, when the racing got underway, Matchless was the #1 machine, and then came the Triumph Twin, helped by Bud Ekins, because Bud went from Matchless to Triumph, and Triumph became the leading bike. And then Greaves started, and the 250s would go nearly as quickly as the 500. Greaves became it, and then Husqvarna took over, and I ran out of puff after that, but there were definite periods when a particular bike was the most popular tool, and Norton had it went Matchless, Triumph, 650 Norton, and then came Greaves. Greaves chased Norton out of the desert, but Norton led the desert in the late 50s. for about three years.
Yeah. And they had a strong contingent of riders on the P11s later on.
Yes, they were
Yeah,
650s and 750s.
Yeah, yeah.
With the advantage of a Norton over a Triumph, I feel, is the torque. You know, it's a torque area.
A lot of torque.
Thanks to Mr. Hopwood's cylinder head.
Yeah. Right, let's look at the next slide, Mike. So we're jumping now from the States to a scene
South London.
South London. Yeah.
Well,
Tell us about that.
Peter Scatchard and the chaps from the Norton Owners Club would know more about this than I do, but there are two claims to how the Norton Owners Club, which is a great club, how it began. Some people say it was at Eric Oliver's premises at Staines, and Gerald Davidson, who is a mighty figure in the industry, he worked for Taylor Madison. He said the Norton Owners Club started in Taylor Madison's basement. So I'll leave you with those two stories. Ask around afterwards and you'll probably get to the truth, but both stories may both be a factor, but thank goodness they did when they did. Yeah. And that's Eric Oliver's. Incidentally, I was very friendly with Jenks, of whom passenger for Eric Oliver on one of his championship years. I used to lend Jenks a bike for the press trial, and I'd have 2 hours alone, one-to-one with Dennis Jenkinson, which was very interesting, going up to Brands Hatch. He'd then ride my bike and fall off it a bit, and then we'd go back another 2 hours. And he told me something fascinating about Eric Oliver. He said he would have been world champion at whatever he did. He was so determined. Interesting comment, isn't it?
Yeah, it certainly is, yeah. Jenks wrote a wonderful feature in Classic Bike on one of the very first issues about racing with Eric Oliver, and he said his main role was to do everything up as tight as you possibly could. Mike, let's switch from America for a while. We're coming up to lunch break in a few minutes, but let's switch. You're 2 years in America, but you come back to England, and the English scene is on fire. And the Norton Commandos are being raced by Peter Williams, working on the works bikes. Did you have any involvement with the John Player sponsorship and the race and the match races, etc.?
Apart from watching and attending, technically no, management no, but we were supportive. The John Player and Norton team, which was a great success, although the bikes were slow. Relatively slow and not that reliable. We did have some good wins. Formula 750, 1972 or 1973 TT, Hutchinson 100 and so on. We weren't without success. Peter Williams and Mick Grant had their first and second in the island. Norman White won a Thruxton production race and so on. But the John Player connection came about through Dennis Paul's racing car connection. He bumped into the right bloke at Silverstone one day and persuaded him to get involved with, and you may remember that the early John Player Nortons were in a Cornish, I call them Cornish crockery colour, blue and white stripes, before going to the red, white and blue. Oh yes, that has a little connection with Norton. I'd been in America about 5 or 6 weeks, and that was by July or something, and we, NBC, had then sold 1,500 bikes or something since January the 1st, and Dennis Paul put up a reward to the team. My contribution was merely 5 or 6 weeks, and he sent us all 9 of us, and various partners were involved, to Las Vegas for the evening, an afternoon flight, a dinner show, and then back again, which was an eye-opener for me, not only being in America for the first time, but going to, and it was at Caesar's Palace. we weren't able to book Sinatra or Elvis or Dean Martin. We had, and it wasn't Michael Jackson either, it was the Something Brothers, pretty corny, and Andy Williams, oh yes. Andy Williams and these 4 or 5 brothers, that was the show we saw. And 2 years later, I did a race, it was a sort of hare and hounds. It was from Barstow to Vegas, biggest race in the world, 3,200 riders, and started in California, finished in Las Vegas, finished at 6, it got dark at 6. The race started at 8, the first 1,600 riders went at 8 o'clock, and the second wave went at 9 o'clock. It got dark at 6 o'clock. The winner, J.N. Roberts, took about 5 hours. So he started at 8, finished at 1. At 6 o'clock it got dark, so the finishers moved the finishing line to their HQ at Caesar's Palace. And at midnight there were still blokes on open pipe motorbikes coming down the strip at Las Vegas looking for Caesar's Palace, arriving, and even before they'd sign off, the first thing they'd do is wash their bike off in the fountains, being motorcyclists. And of course, on one side of the drive-in, there were these Cadillac limos with glamorous people arriving for the show. And on the other side, just yards away, a lot of noisy, dirty motorcyclists washing their bikes in the fountain. One of the most bizarre scenes I've ever seen. But they would have about 1,800 finishers out of those 3,200. But with people breaking down, getting lost, crashing, and so on, it took a whole day to clear up the mess. But, and that was another link with Caesar's Palace.
It's interesting that the book Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas was written as a result of Hunter Thompson being sent to cover the Mint 400. Did you ever meet Hunter Thompson?
No, thankfully not.
If you've ever read that book, it's like riding a bike with no bars.
Yes, a little bit too far out, man.
Right, it's coming up to lunchtime, ladies and gentlemen. We're back at 1 o'clock, and we'd like to see you all come back. We'll have a Q&A session, and we'll be joined by Paul Smith, Vice Chairman of the club, and Peter White, Chairman, and Mike Here's President. So you have the 3 main people.
Could I just interject one little statement for people to think about, not over lunch, but I think TVS, you know, have rescued Norton and paid for Norton. And the other day I compiled a list of Norton owners, and TVS are the 14th. It's purely a coincidence that Stuart Garner was the 13th. But I think you'd be quite interested, and I may not be wholly accurate chronologically here, but the owners are, we start with Parr Norton, and that would be what, 1904, 1908.
1998. Yeah.
And then Shelley, and then Mansell, and then Vanderbilt, and then Associated, post-war, Associated Motorcycles, and then Dennis Poor, Norton Villiers, and then LaRue, and then
Aquilini.
we used to call him Vacuumini because nothing happened, you know, and Scalvania, and then Keith Moore at Shenston, and then some people called Mid-America, and then Ollie Kern with Kenny Dreer, and then Garner, and now TVS. So it's, I feel, not a next please, I don't think that will be required. I think they're set as fair as they've ever been with TVS, who, you know, publicly, as we know, put £4 or £5 million by to sort out the dodgy bikes from the previous ownership. So it's looking quite good. Should we close on that note?
We can close on that. Yeah, Mike's right. It's a very honourable standpoint that TVS seem to have made by making sure, as best they can, that the people who placed orders and their expensive motorbikes will actually get their machines in the long run. So perhaps we'll ask Mike a bit more about TVS. He's been to look around the factory and find out a bit more what we think the future of Norton is. Okay, well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attendance this morning. A round of applause.